So coming up next is a panel on layer 2s, scaling solutions and the path to mass adoption. So I'd like to introduce the moderator, which is Pim from Maven 11. So please give a round of applause. Woo! You can sit here, and then you can introduce your panelists. It should work. Just speak.
Hello, hello.
Yeah.
Go.
Test.
So I'm Pim with Maven 11, I guess homegrown Amsterdam-based crypto VC. With me, I think I've brought Josh. Maybe you want to do your own introduction.
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh. I'm the CEO and founder at Astria.
Also brought Diederik, better known as Proto Lambda.
Hello, everybody. I work at CryptoCanal, work on layer 2.
Go right ahead.
I'm Stark Hyens. I work at KasarLabs, and we're a research and engineering company on Starknet.
And finally, Raza.
Yeah, I'm the only guy with a picture. Raza, I'm a DevRaw at Scroll. We're layer 2 ZK VM rollup.
So this is a panel on L2s, adoption, I think in particular, of L2s. I think maybe to sort of set the stage, I think it would be interesting to look into sort of the scaling roadmap that Ethereum and sort of all the L2s seem to have taken. So curious, this is an open question to everybody. Why do you think sort of everybody seems to have converged on the same path towards scalability? So we've moved away from old school things like execution sharding, these sorts of things. Why are we all doing sort of the same things right now?
I'll take a stab at this question. So with Ethereum, various different things have been attempted. There was this long talk about EWASM, sharding and many different forms and shapes in the specifications. Then didn't really get into the clients as we know them today. And I think this is partially due to constraints on only ever being able to do one thing with one group. Whereas with layer 2, you split the problem into many smaller things that specialists can work on, and they can experiment, and they can be competitive. And you have this market force that creates a lot more, forces a lot more creativity to execute.
Yeah, actually, if you look at rollups, they're built on top of Ethereum, right? And they inherit the security of Ethereum. So it's way easier to build a rollup than kind of rebuild your own new chain from bottom up. So as a rollup, you just have to focus on scalability issues and not on security features which are already on Ethereum.
Yeah, it's also, I think, something Proto was getting at was the governance issue of trying to get everyone within Ethereum layer 1 to actually adopt something like sharding requires it to be a very, very robust solution from day one the moment it's implemented. Rollups are able to do this kind of progressive development process, and they're kind of permissionless in their nature of development. You can put a contract on there, you can choose how you write data to Ethereum, you can do that on your own. It doesn't force everyone who's using Ethereum to use that rollup from day one. So it just allows the development process to be less bogged down by kind of a bureaucratic process because it's not forcing everyone in. It's an opt-in method.
Yeah, just to add on, I think maybe from a different angle, I also think specifically for zero knowledge, I think the tech developed much faster than expected. So that's why you see maybe a convergence to a faster pace towards the adoption and application of zero knowledge. And then I think number 2, and maybe that's also what you're saying, is the developer experience, right? I mean, the fact that whatever you did on L1, you can do now on L2 without, it's seamless. It's an RPC URL change. Makes it that much easier. It means there's no actually new audience to acquire. It's just people know hey, we understand the problem and now there is a solution for us. And then you see this mass moving towards that. And at the end, that helps the growth in the space and the pace as well.
Maybe to sort of piggyback off of this, do you foresee any sort of social or technical developments happening anytime soon that would maybe steer us away from the current roadmap that we're going? I don't know, advancements in maybe hardware scaling, or could be anything on a social front? Or do we see this as being sort of the way we're going and we're going to continue going this way for a very long time?
Well, we'll see both things happening, right? So we have many different EVM-related rollups. And so to differentiate, you have to build culture, you have to fund your ecosystem. But then at the same time, there are technical improvements to be made in these things as well. And maybe it's time for like a layer 2 standard for the EVM. Maybe there are other improvements to be made. But yeah, there are these two different fronts. With culture, you can have a strong rollup. And in a technical sense, you can also have a very strong rollup.
I also seen like this trend that at least on Starknet, some people are like, hey, will this layer 2 ever become a layer 1? And you know, it's a big question because you have this really cool layer 1. So could this other really cool layer become a layer 1 as well? But it's a cool thing, but it doesn't make sense since Ethereum already is super secure and is focusing on decentralization. So let's actually continue building this other layer that's focusing on scalability.
Yeah, I guess I have like a somewhat different perspective on it, I guess, just coming from like the Celestia ecosystem, right, and building on top of that, and seeing like a possibility for kind of a new technical improvement on like the base layer being kind of more specialized to like it's just going to do data, that's all it's going to do. And so that's an argument less of, you know, Ethereum going towards like a sharded roadmap and doing execution, and more saying, well, okay, if we just lean into the roll-up thing and say, well, okay, the roll-up's what they want out of an L1, is, you know, by and large just like data throughput with like security on top of that, then you can see customization there, you know, and I think we're seeing obviously like Ethereum work towards, you know, a similar thing. You know, it's not going to like a minimized layer, but it is, you know, working with 4844 and then like danksharding after that to improve throughput. But I don't think either of these are like pointing us towards, you know, execution sharding as like the future. It's more like, okay, we're doing the roll-up thing, that seems to be going pretty well, let's optimize for that.
Yeah, I think so from a culture point of view, I don't know like how that would apply. I definitely think that disruptive, maybe not empowering, yes, where I still think that Web3 hasn't come to the masses yet. And regardless of UX, UI, and the technical side of things, I just think that's like a general component of education missing, which obviously we need to solve the tech side of things. But if you look at something like taking a side step, what I think, the reason why I believe OpenAI ChatGPT took the world by storm, if I extremely simplify it, it's complex stack that went directly to an end user, and then they could use it, boom. And I think that from a culture point of view or education point of view, that's still missing in Web3, that's to be solved. From a technical side of things, let me provide a different perspective because all panelists had great answers. I think something that, regardless of rollups and the ZK side of things, I think the whole dimensions of layers is changing, because if you look at modularity, which I don't think died out, but seems like the discussion has gone on the background, L3s is becoming a thing with Lens starting, you know, the Bonsai Mocha thing, and a Fuel, for instance, an execution layer, which, you know, operates outside of the dimensions of layers because it can be it doesn't deal with data, it deals with only the execution part of things. So I think that there's definitely some things left and right in the corners of my eyes that I'm looking at, thinking, hey, exists outside of the dimensions and worlds of rollups that I don't think disrupting, but can contribute towards solving a scalability issue, which I'm also stoked about. And then to my previous point, in the previous question, I think I made them sure, but we're not there yet. So for ZK, we're also like, we're still very much, you know, maturing is not the right word, has to apply correctly and optimize and develop.
That makes sense. Maybe, Diederik, you mentioned a layer 2 standard for EVMs. How would you see that?
So like the challenging part right now with layer 1 is that we have 1 or 2 upgrades per year at best. And so a lot of these layer 2s are trying to move faster, they have ambition to move faster. And specifically for these type of application layer changes, there are resources to move faster, but there's not the standard to move faster. And there's this subtle balance between like trying to avoid fragmentation while also trying to be like modular and competitive. And these things, they clash. There's nothing that prevents EVM rollups from introducing something additional to the EVM. But aside from this cultural thing that we shouldn't try and invent the wheel again with EVM features and then diverge between all these things. Like these rollups together within Ethereum, it works so well because they're still kind of similar. A lot of these value like adds that you have in one rollup, they add to another rollup, and like Ethereum has this edge over other chains that we should recognize, where okay, we have thin layers that are trying not to do too much, and then this culture to try and build on top of that without creating more fragmentation. Although sometimes we do see more of these ecosystem splits, which I don't particularly like.
Okay, so you do see somewhere maybe a balance between standardization.
Yeah, there can be a future where there's a layer 2 standard of some kind. But again, if we prevent fragmentation, because that would only hurt the ecosystem.
Okay. Maybe diving into the technical side a little bit in terms of, fostering adoption with the release of sort of alternative DA layers like Celestia, as Josh mentioned, also of course 4844, and then full-on dank sharding coming somewhere soon, TM, I guess. What do you think that'll do in terms of adoption? Like what sort of factor of additional adoption do you think we'll see? And do you think this technical side is really what's been sort of the main hurdle for now? Or do you think user adoption is maybe, hurdled somewhere else?
So the majority of the costs on layer 2s today, vast majority, like 90% or more, is just data cost. And so improving this data cost, whether it's with LTA like Celestia, or whether it's with some layer 1 improvements, it should have really improved the usability of layer 2s in a way where, not in terms of UX, but just in viability and being able to support new applications with lower costs. And yeah, I think that changes the game, although it's very difficult to speculate on the demand and on the supply of data like that. Whereas it's this cautious balance between security, you don't want to stress layer 1 too much, and you do want to like provide the space to these rollups that are actively competing and growing.
Yeah, maybe like unpopular opinion, because you mentioned user adoption. Inside our bubble, yes, but it won't make the bubble bigger. I just don't think so. It's the same. Like I'm fucking stoked about. Sorry, I'm stoked about zero knowledge, but it's not gonna make my grandma use the blockchain. So, yeah, I think that's my short answer. I think yes, but within our bubble, 100% it solves problems, but like user adoption, generally speaking, no.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite that bearish, maybe, in that like it won't help at all. I mean, I think like a factor, right? If we say like, okay, the average transaction cost is like 10 times cheaper, you can have 10 times more transactions. Someone will find a way to make some, application that is either better than an existing one or an improvement on an existing one that will get some, at the very least, marginal increase in number of users using it. But I think, we can kind of take lessons from like Solana here, and that like Solana has like, essentially like functionally zero, zero cost transaction from like an end user perspective. But it does not have like, this super high quantity of like users relative to Ethereum. So it's not like the only thing that is necessary there. However, one of the big things that, drives a lot of usage to Ethereum is like there's a large depth of liquidity there, and it has the highest security budget, right? So if you combine that with like lower transaction fees, you will see like presumably an increase in things, if it's just because of use cases, or it's just because there are some people who say, oh, I'd use the chain, 5 times more if it was 10 times cheaper or whatever.
Yeah, I think definitely cost is a big argument here, as well transaction throughput, but also the way you kind of build your application, where how will you display the fact that a user has to pay a certain transaction. Like if it's a newcomer and you display the transaction fee, like what's the user experience? Like will they just abandon their process, or will they just go through it, or another option that they may have. But at the end of the day, you also have to think about in terms of the user's interface and the user experience, and how do you actually include all of those like visuals for newcomers, for new users of the Ethereum chain.
Yeah, I think doubling down on that, like there's just a reality that like using a blockchain right now, like for any application, is like pretty technical relative to like anything else you do in like a normal app. but it's not just technical in like the friction. It also has like a literal cost associated with it, and then there's additional friction in having that cost, right? Okay, I'm a user, I need to go get a Coinbase account to go use like a DeFi app or whatever, and I need to make sure I get my token. So we've introduced technical complexity, but also they say, hey, I want to try a thing, and that's going to cost me like $1. And one of the kind of like, sad realities of like consumer applications is that any like cost, even if it is like a wholly trivial cost, is like consumers do not do like accounting like a business does accounting, where a business will say, hey, I'm going to get $100 of value out of this, I'm happy to pay $10. There's a reason that like when we saw, the app stores gain prominence, they were all like, oh, it's 99 cents for an app, we'll collect like $1 on the app. That's like nothing. It's very easy to provide $1 value to someone. But users were just like, I'm just not going to pay $1 for this. And so all the apps were free and they monetized on the back end. And every B2B application has like a free trial, because the reality is like having to pay first introduces an enormous amount of friction. And so if we want to draw in, a very, very large kind of additional cohort of users, we probably are looking at something in this kind of account abstraction-y kind of realm where you can say, okay, the transaction fee is 0 for the first whatever transaction. There's a lot of complexity due to like Sybil attacks and sock puppets and whatever that like prevents you from doing kind of like any naive design for like gasless transactions. But it's very obviously like something that every other consumer application has done, is reducing that friction for an end user. And that's probably the biggest lever that would bring like a large new cohort of users into the ecosystem.
Well, you mentioned bringing the fees down maybe for new users by doing these sort of gas subsidies. At the same time, Arbitrum, for instance, set to make, I don't know, it's like 10 million, I think, annualized revenue just by running their single centralized sequencer. Whether this actually ends up somewhere in the hands of ARB token holders, this I don't know. But at the same time, this sort of notion of decentralized and also shared sequencer networks has taken some hold, at least in the current mind share of crypto. So what are your sort of views on this whole process of decentralizing these sequencers, L2s plugging into shared sequencer networks, these sorts of things?
Yeah, like obviously building like a shared sequencer, I have like an enormous bias towards like this question here, right? I think it's a compelling idea. One of the things I view very like beneficial about it, similar to I think like Proto's earlier point on like the ability to innovate, right, is like one of the benefits of a shared sequencer, is you can view it as like a decentralized sequencer that lets you innovate on a state machine by making a new state machine. If you can kind of resolve the composability issues, you can say, okay, we're not giving up, our decentralization work. I see it as kind of a resolution to difficulties of progressive decentralization, and we use kind of the marketing term of like, decentralized by default, right? It's kind of a goal if we want to have an abundant world of like, a dozen rollups or 2 dozen rollups or like 10 dozen rollups or whatever. To like the Arbitrum point, right? I think that's actually like an interesting point on like how that could be used to do like this kind of fee abstraction. Would love to understand like the Starkware perspective, because as I understand it, like Starkware doesn't have transaction fees, or at least some of like the applications building on Starknet. I know like DYDX got a lot of users initially by just abstracting gas fees. So this is a potential area where you can use the treasury. I don't think that option goes away if you decentralize the sequencer. Fundamentally, going from, okay, we have one entity, it collects all the transactions fees and thus has control over how to redistribute those transaction fees, whether it handles that through a DAO governance process or whatnot, it still kind of has kind of control to some whatever kind of, system it uses to distribute that control over a larger pool of fees, whereas if it does decentralization, there's presumably going to be some amount of like MEV extraction, there's a competition for whoever is running these sequencers, and some subset of those fees, it may be a large subset of those fees, might not want to be redistributed to users. So there's kind of a fundamental trade-off in control and your ability to like improve a user experience, but I think that's just an inherent trade-off of like centralization versus decentralization. If you're centralized, you have more resources and more control to provide a higher quality user experience. The kind of difficult game we're playing here is trying to solve that problem without kind of using that, fallback to just like centralizing a point and then saying, oh, we can resolve all the problems with like a centralized kind of middleman there.
I think for most rollups, decentralizing the sequencer is definitely on the roadmap. If you look at what Starkware is planning on doing, what they did was kind of split their roadmap in 3 steps. So first focus on functionality, then focus on performance, and then on decentralization. Right now we're focusing on performance. And most of the time when people ask you, okay, how do you decentralize the sequencer? They tend to think of it in a technical perspective, but you also have to view it, okay, how do you decentralize it in terms of your community. So for instance, what Starkware did was kind of start this foundation back in January, where they would identify core contributors to the network, and then those core contributors start participating in the delegation of protocols updates, let's say, on the network. So that's also a way to kind of decentralize your network. Another way is to do maybe open source most of the parties on your layer. So I know that there's this organization called OnlyDust. What they do is that they kind of onboard devs that are developing on Starknet, and they kind of participate on open source projects, and in exchange they kind of get some money. So it's also a nice way for newcomers to Starknet to easily start making some money. So that's also another way to start decentralizing your network, right? Just making everything open source. And maybe another way is to also rely on some external contributors. I know that Lambda class is rustifying the Cairo VM. So they're moving from a Pythonic to a rustic Cairo VM. And that's also another way to maybe decentralize it. It's just, all right, let's have these external people kind of come work with us and improve our core architecture of a layer to make everything work better, I guess.
So in some ways, I think you hinted at a little bit in terms of how can you decentralize, and maybe also how does that compete with some other ecosystems? Because in some ways, you all seem to be working on somewhat competitive projects. Obviously, we've got like Starkware and Scroll and the OP stack / Superchain. So within that sort of competition for user activity, transactions, what do you see as sort of the main thing that you are doing to stand out? Do you feel you even need to stand out at all? But I think you do. And in that perspective, sort of, what are you doing to be different from other L2s, from other ecosystems?
Right, so I think we have a lot of open source. It's about creating this community of people that feel that they can make an impact, but then also be rewarded. So with Optimism, we're trying to make this a thing that's like core to the protocol, RetroPTF, where every project that contributes to the ecosystem gets rewarded for their impact by the governance process. And like this abstract thing, like just rewarding your contributors, figuring out how to balance open source contributions, just shifts this thing from like closed source companies to like a whole open source space that can be competitive and innovative, where alternatives can exist even for the same protocol. And like that strikes this nice balance where you do not fragment, but you do get innovation, you do get alternatives, you do get creativity within your thing. And I think that's something other chains, other layer ones might be missing, where things look very monolithic.
Yeah, we walk, I guess, on a similar path where Scroll is open source since day one. Very close relationship with the Ethereum Foundation. Maybe to approach from a different angle, because obviously, like we also have like community being very like community first. Continuously, we ask ourselves, what is the value we bring to developers? I think that there are multiple ways to approach it. As someone who tinkers with stuff a lot, a friend of mine, Patrick Collins, I was talking to him, and he said, I asked him, but what makes you pick a chain? You know, he's outside of the chain ecosystem. Because really, it's death by 1,000 cuts. So it's not necessarily what attracts me to a chain. It's like, does it work as promised? Like, is your getting started page, like how is that? Is it really like copy paste or not? And so I think that when it comes to chains, in its core, maybe it's almost boring because it's like it seems monolithical, like the other panel has mentioned, but there's a lot more that you can do to bring value. Like rewarding core contributions is one thing. Another thing is that understanding the needs of developers and what kind of services do you provide, or not service, I don't know like the word service, but what kind of value do you provide alongside? I think one of the things that Solana deserves credit for, as to per my knowledge, is that they did help developers and early stage project raise very easy. And their hacker house experience was extremely well. So I spoke to Solana devs myself, and these are things that come back. So it's really like understanding the needs of your devs and community by that sense, and how well can you help them from 0 to 1 and 1 to 100, even if that means that you're operating outside of your own comfort zone. So I guess I guess that's my answer. It's very much like Scroll continues to think like, what is the main value that we provide to devs? Understanding that also the end game is that killer dApps are built on your chain, but doing it, not saying that other parties don't, but doing it in an ethical way and in a conscious way.
There's also not one rollup for every single use case out there. So let's say, obviously I'm biased and I'm more focused on Starknet. If you look at what Starknet has and what they do is that, for instance, you could do generative art on-chain or an on-chain game because you have this programming language that directly communicates with the prover to generate these CK proofs, which makes everything kind of more efficient. So having your own, oh, by the way, Starkware is not EVM compatible. So we're not EVM compatible because we have this own programming language. And because you have this own programming language, so you communicate with the prover more easily, and in a way, you start making more efficient verifications in some way. One also other cool thing about Starkware is that they just the way they communicate from the layer 2 to the layer 1, which is just the way they deal with data is this logarithmic compression. So everything is much more lighter when you verify it on the layer 1. So picking your rollup definitely depends on the use case. And if you're looking for something that's very intense in terms of computation, then maybe you're more looking into solutions like Starknet. But if you're if you have another use case, maybe you're looking to optimism, for instance.
I do think there's an interesting question of kind of how you differentiate a rollup while kind of avoiding fragmentation. It feels like there's some kind of fundamental push-pull there of saying like my rollup is different and better while also being exactly as compatible, and the same thing from a developer perspective. You know, you can see things at like a consensus layer. You know, we've seen Arbitrum have a lot of discussion around like fair ordering, right? And so you're like, all right, maybe Arbitrum decides they want to be the chain that has like, you know, Jane Street and like Jump trading at it because like latency game is like the most optimal thing to trade there. And so it's like the most well-capitalized whales trade on Arbitrum because they've chosen like latency as kind of how they want MAV to be extracted, whether they choose to admit that or not. You know, versus, you know, we also see Arbitrum going with kind of like Stylus, which is, you know, falls in the broader like EVM plus category, whereas, you know, Optimism's kind of superchain has shown to kind of be, you know, maybe not horizontally scaling, but going like horizontal with like kind of different use cases, right? Where you'll have, okay, Base is probably going to be a really, really good way to on-ramp or onboard like a very large number of Coinbase customers. But fundamentally, when it comes to like a developer perspective, right, there is, you know, if you maintain 100% compatibility, then at some point you're kind of the same unless you just twiddle the block time, which at some point kind of, again, will just compress. So I still think there's like an open question. We're just at a, you know, small n enough of like rollups right now that like, okay, once we get to 10, everyone's gonna be like, why are there 10 rollups that are all 95% the same? You know, the 11th person is gonna have to be like, okay, I guess I'm not gonna be as compatible as the others because I have to find some unique value proposition.
Yeah, but maybe also like, if I may, like to the panelists, come from the Web2 world, I guess we all have like a relationship with the Web2 world. I had this discussion as well with a friend of mine. It's like, okay, yeah, every L2 just looks the same, like another L2. It's like, yeah, but we wouldn't want one cloud provider, would we? So.
But we only have 3.
No, right now, yeah. Unfortunately, that's what
I don't think there's a 4th coming up. I'm not bullish on Oracle Cloud.
No, but.
And I worked for the middling third.
Right. So, and I would say unfortunately, because I think choice for the market is good. So and you know, behind the scenes, I mean, sure, AWS, Azure, they're a little bit different, but that's exactly my point. It's like you could say they all sell cheesecake in a little bit of a different flavor. But I think the one thing that a consumer misses is choice. So I'm not necessarily as opposed to having.
Yeah, not to derail the conversation repeatedly, but I think we do see this evolving in the cloud world, which I think the largest participant being like Lambda, not like Lambda class, right? But like Lambda's new entrant, but like very specifically they provide GPU compute optimized for AI, but like they had to differentiate, right? They are not, you go to, you know, AWS, Azure, GCP, you can get a hosted Kubernetes, a hosted, you know, S3 compatible API, you can get a compute thing, you can get a load balancer, you can get everything that is exactly the same. Like literally when GCS launched, it was intentionally API compatible with S3. So very similar to like, we want the rollups to be all compatible with each other because that allows you to be a seamless copy from an end user perspective, but at some point all their margins just drive down. You know, they rake something in like a 66% margin, and if you're a large customer, that drops much lower. And which is why they all kind of differentiate on, you know, trying to have a different database, whether it's like Cosmos DB or DynamoDB or Spanner or whatever. And now when we're seeing new entrants in the market, they're saying, okay, well, I'm going to focus on being the AI compute chain. So with rollups, I think that's what we'd see as a thing. If we say, okay, well, there's Arbitrum and there's like Optimism and there's like Scroll and, you know, ZK Sync and you know, Polygon, ZK EVM, right? Like, and then there's Base, which at least has like, you know, a very obvious like immediate onboarding experience. You're like, what is like the 7th EVM compatible rollup going to do that like justifies its position in the market and makes devs say, oh, I'm going to pick you over the other 6 options on the table, right? That's where I think we start seeing like someone has to do something new here, and that's where we're going to start risking kind of fragmentation, and there might be like an inevitability to that.
Yeah, so I think, small point, I think there will be fragmentation, but I also think that there will be subtle nuances. So even if you look at, you know, the ZK rollups, the reason why types exist and soon, like even among the same box set types, there will be trade-offs between gas fees and security. So I think that, I'm not sure if it's enough to differentiate, but there definitely will be differentiation, and especially when the use case with high volumes, yeah, then gas fees may make a lot of sense. And then, so I'm not sure if the differentiation is going to be enough, but I definitely see that happening, the differentiation being there. And I also feel like, yeah, I definitely think with modularity, you know, not to throw a buzzword or hype word in it, but I think that just like slams the whole board into, yeah, disrupting the dimensions of layers.
So I'm hearing a lot of sort of developer adoption, and then trying to differentiate to some degree. Josh, you also mentioned Base. I think we've heard it before in this conversation. What do you think about the sort of, I guess, corporate rollups like a Base or Consensus Linea? Like they are, I don't think they're focusing that much on differentiation, but they do have this edge in terms of user onboarding that maybe some of the current ecosystems don't have. So are you in favor? Do you strongly dislike them? Are you sort of meh about them? Curious to hear what you guys' opinions are.
I can give like a kind of like cynical take of like we've seen Coinbase trend towards like, I think it's good for like Coinbase, right? Coinbase is very heavily trended like engineering resources towards like focusing on like decentralized things, right? They have like Coinbase Wallet. They're just leveraging more resources into kind of like staking, and potentially they'll look at like non-custodial staking. And you know, Base is like a similar strategy to I think what we've seen with like Mantle and like BitNow, where they're saying like, okay, if we are like a larger entity in like the billions of dollars, what is our like identity within Web3, or like where do we gather kind of our like resources? And people are starting to realize like, oh, we can have our own chain, and that can be where we kind of gather all of the different things we are working on under one kind of like house, and that gives a cohesive picture. For Coinbase, it says like, okay, well, would we want to kind of do, you know, partnerships here, partnerships there, have to renegotiate every time we say, hey, we have Base, we have control over that. You know, they have, you know, what changes they want to do that's kind of like within their power, and therefore it allows them to kind of vertically integrate while still being within the more decentralized side than something on like Coinbase.com, right, within that. From like a differentiation, like I don't think Base needs to be like differentiated. Base can be like bog standard, like OP stack. It like works quite well. And they'll just say like, look, we have like all of the users in North America. We will just put a button on Coinbase.com that says like, hey, when you buy this, would you like to get $5 free on Base? Or would you like to click this button to bridge to Base? And now you have the on-ramp. Everyone else who does not have that is going to have to differentiate because they don't have however many million users that they can just seamlessly give one click button and say, great, they're onboarded, you know? From their perspective, it makes like absolutely perfect sense, because getting a top of funnel is like ridiculously expensive. You have a top of funnel, just go monetize it.
Okay, it does make sense, but do you agree with it? Do you think there's maybe some centralizing like issues here in terms of this one company basically steering millions of people into their preferred rollup?
Yeah, I mean, they're like a U.S. publicly traded corporation. Like, the government is going to have some, like, requirements there. Like, you know, if Tornado Cash is deployed on that, like, someone's going to have a conversation and be like, hey, maybe don't do that. Maybe just remove that code, and we'll find out, like, how exactly permissionless it is. And it all kind of falls into this kind of, like, deal with the devil middle ground thing, right? Like, do we end up making a half step and then getting stopped, where we say, hey, they managed to onboard another 1 million people, and we just, like, doubled the number of like people like within like this, you know, region using like rollups or like Ethereum on like a, you know, daily active users, but they're actually having like a half experience because they're all KYC'd and, you know, whatever. Is that like better? And I guess it fundamentally is just like, well, do you think if they go on base, they're only ever going to go on base? How KYC'd are the bridges going to be? We haven't yet seen like capital controls on like bridges between chains yet. If it's a roll up, right, I think like that's structurally kind of like hard to do, but we'll see. Like, is, you know, if you use like the super chain contract as like a bridging thing, then my presumption is like that won't be like KYC. So you can just say, well, okay, if you're on base, you're doing KYC, whatever, but you can always just go bridge to the L1 through like the, you know, enshrined bridge, and then you can just go bridge up to somewhere else, and at least you got your foot in the door. So I think it's like certainly like a net positive here. We'll see if we just like slam into a wall and say, oh, actually we got like 10 million people on, but they're all used to KYC things, and they'll never move away from that. You know, is that a win? I don't know.
Okay, I couldn't stir the pot enough, I guess. I was hoping for some spicier opinions, guys. I don't know how much time we have left, to be honest. Maybe as a final question, sort of what is your spicy take with regards to L2s? Do you have anything you want to put in the minds of the audience?
So we're seeing this frequent fights on Twitter, like what's the right chain, what's the right thing. In general, like we have thick layers and thin layers, but they just try to solve many problems at once or fewer problems. If we figure out how to stack them together well, how to keep things coherent, how to create this culture of contributions in open source, I think there would be less fights. And I hope that for some of these rollups, we can see that contributing back to Ethereum. The spicy take is that I don't really see this happening. But within rollups, I think we can create this culture that, yes, you can run the same stack and you can enjoy working together on modular open source.
Yeah, maybe to throw pepper and salt on it. So wasn't Lisbon like a similar question? And someone on the panel was pretty convinced that there will be a shared sequencer or the multi-prover theory, which, if for people who don't know, is basically means you know, there's a shared prover network used by multiple, let's say, Linea, Scroll, and Polygon. And yeah, I think I'm more on the cynical side, where we have to recognize that there are a lot of people inside this company that are there for the community, join Web3 for the ethos, whether that's close to Ethereum foundation principles or not. That's like, there's something generic there that they want to provide value for developers. However, there are still companies, and there are objectives and strategic goals, etc. So I have difficulties seeing that there will be that level of cooperation based from what I'm seeing. I have hope on the research and engineering side of things, but I definitely think that there will be more of a competition. That's sometimes how it feels. If Twitter says anything, it seems like, you know, all I see is jabs and stabs. So yeah, I think that's not done. I really hope that there will be less fragmentation, etc. But what I think is going to happen is a more aggressive strategy on acquiring and onboarding, and a more territorial approach as L2 rise, and especially like we haven't seen the end of it. Who knows how many L2s will still come? So we're not done yet. Though I will say I will end it on a positive note that I think that many of my friends are at competing L2s. And we talk about all the time on the tech side of things. Hey, what's your approach on helping hackers and builders? I was just talking to the DevRel of Linea. I was like, hey, I was doing this. I was actually recommending Truffle. Spoke with Deborah at Polygon. So it's like, I think that there's definitely multiple angles at the multiple dimensions in the community that will stick together.
Yeah, I guess I can double down with like one more spicy take here. I think this might like centralize at like the app layer, and maybe the L2s all get abstracted away. Like if you take like aggregator theory and look at like Google, and you say like, okay, Google goes to like many websites, but like, do you care what website you're on? You could get to a point where you're like, all right, you're trading on like Uniswap, but like, do you care which chain your funds on Uniswap are? If that is completely seamlessly like hidden from you and the UX gets clean, and now we all just use Uniswap's wallet, which has Uniswap, and Uniswap is the aggregator across whatever chain. So.
And maybe to close it off, but my spicy take is that incompatible EVM chains are actually very, very powerful. And that you have many ZK EVM compatible chains, and you have some incompatible EVM chains, and that people shouldn't just focus on, oh, this is Ethereum talking to Ethereum, let's go with this one. You might have some major technological improvements when it's, oh, this is not Ethereum, this is not Solidity, but it can talk to Ethereum, I might consider that. So there are some major, major benefits when it comes to transpiling and talking directly to your prover on the layer 2.
That's clear. I've got two more audience questions that I do want to get through. So first question was, do you think the time to achieve hard finality in optimistic rollups might be an obstacle for mass adoption? I think, Proto, this one's for you.
So there's this confusion between two types of finality. There's finality of making things irreversible. If the inputs to the rollup are on layer 1, the batch data is on layer 1, it can be irreversible as soon as the layer 1 makes it irreversible. And this is not different between any rollups. This is a property of the layer 1. And then there's this other property of finality, in the legacy version, what we call the how quickly do you see what happens on layer 2 on layer 1. And I think layer 2s with bigger ecosystems and shared sequencing, shared proving systems won't really see this problem much. But then fundamentally, you do still have the optimistic proofs be slower than the ZK proofs because of the dispute period time.
I think we see like, I think it's been termed like optimistic ZK rollups, right? Where like the amount of like batching time to make like efficient ZK proofs will be like less than like the 7-day window, but you'll still probably use like ZK proofs long term as like a finality gadget, but like there'll still be like an optimistic window. But I also agree, right? Like the finality that people talk about is like fundamentally finality from the bridge, which is a light client of the rollup. So it's really like, when can a light client get like sufficient finality that can verify itself? And that is one of either like a 7-day window or like a ZK proof. I do think we'll trend to ZK proofs once they're kind of generally available, easy to use, and like easy to use kind of more broadly, rather than just being like, you know, Scroll's done a great job getting like a ZK EVM going, but like everyone else will use them when like it is like generally available tech, and you can say, okay, I just took guess and like jammed it into like a ZK VM and got a proof out, and that didn't require like 3 years of R&D.
Okay. So the last question is, what are your thoughts on app chains operating on the L2 level secured by mainnet? I think we can make this into maybe a more general question around app chains, app rollups. What are your visions there?
So we were talking about what it means to abstract over these different layer 2s. And with app chains, that's like the real fragmentation thing where, oh, suddenly everybody has a chain. And I think you'd want to build like an interface and a culture around all these chains, figure out like how do you have users move between these app chains? Because like this beauty of blockchain in a way is that you can use one DeFi application and then the other without really thinking about moving between them. But now with more chains and more bridges, you get a lot of pain. Bridges are insecure also. But rollups being the most secure form of bridge, you could have imagined like a rollup ecosystem where you can secure the bridge between them, and then there's this market opportunity for the best bridges between them, the best abstractions between them. And maybe that means shared sequencing networks. Who knows? Yeah, there's still some space here for new projects.
Really great, and just calling out like Starkware, right? Like DYDX is an app chain rollup in like this context, and I think again to like the ZKVM point, right? Like DYDX works because you can have like a non-EVM thing that can just be put in like a Stark generator. You can get a ZK proof of that. You can validate that on the L1. That's fine and good, and we'll probably see more of those.
Yeah, and in terms of the user experience, one major thing being built is just this idea of account abstraction, where you kind of abstract the idea of what's an account on Ethereum, and you actually implement this other idea that, okay, every account can now become programmable and modular, where you add some features. So for instance, there's this thing called the hardware signer, where you can actually start validating transactions with your Face ID, because you're using the secure enclave of your iPhone, for instance. And then you're using like this biometric authentication system, so your Face ID or your fingerprint ID, to just validate your transaction. So all these features being built and being implemented into your Ethereum account actually will drive mass adoption of, I guess I'd say that the blockchain level, Web3 mass adoption.
Yeah, split in the middle, because I kind of think that supernets and subnets, I believe, from Avalanche, it's for application-specific chains. I kind of see it also as a door towards mass adoption. Having worked, I think most people have worked for an enterprise. It's kind of like the thing that appeals them a lot. So looking at the market and an adoption of that end of things, whether I want it or not, it seems like a great use case where you could spin up your own chain and I don't know, maybe use depending on the type of architecture, make use of the validators. Or you don't make use of the validators, bring your own validators. So where do I see it going? I do think where I see it going is more and more application-specific chains, or even, and I haven't. This is something I have to dive into, like L3s, like the fact that Lens came with his own LT. I was like, okay, it's now something, and so I do think that it's gearing towards it. And it's definitely happening. And I also believe that it's a way to mass adoption.
I think I'm getting the sign from Jonathan that we are supposed to stop now. So I think I'll leave it here. Thanks a lot, guys, for the panel. Guys, give him a hand.